Okay, Derek, hey, good to see you, man.
Good to see you
Before we
too.
jump in, yeah, before we jump into today, it would be great if you could just talk a little bit about your background, your experience, your journey, so that we can have that.
In a nutshell, I've done both hardware, software design. I've, the big leap was that I've always been in consulting for the longest time, but recently I found myself in an in-house role at Compass Digital Lab where I lead design. Under design, I have researchers, behavioral science, as well as product designers.
Mm,
So that's my team. I'm really having a great time with this team at Compass Digital Labs.
perfect. So maybe talk a little bit more about the team. You talked about behavioral
Science.
design, behavioral
Mhm.
science, and starting to think about behavioral design. Is that something that you've been doing for a while? How long have you been doing it? How have you been hiring these people?
So I would say it's still new to my team. It is something I really believe in. Right now, it's still in its development stage. Let's put it this way.
And that's the first thing that we wanted to talk a little bit more with you about, Derek, is just
Mm.
design and how
Mhm.
you've seen design evolve
Yep.
because you've got that consulting experience, you've got the in-house experience, you've got the
Mhm.
international experience, outside of North America as well as inside North America. So
Mhm.
maybe can you talk a little bit more about how things have changed in terms of the type of work as well as the type of people?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I love to talk about this topic. I think design has gained much more important roles in any organization. Now, the fact is, it's not just about whether it's important or not important. It's about how design is able to weave itself into the fabric of the organization, right? Traditionally, and I still think in a lot of organizations, design is kind of quite downstream, whereas design's role can be very upstream in influencing an organization's strategy or how you even think about the organization itself, right?
And if you're to talk about those opportunities, if you're
Mm,
to try and explain to some of the companies that aren't design led right now,
yeah,
and try to communicate as much as possible, what are some of those opportunities? What would you say?
it's very interesting because we are in an experience economy. True design is done by cross-functional colleagues and functions where they come together to create the experience, um, the unified experience for their users and for the consumers.
So you mentioned on your team that you have certain types of people, right?
Mhm.
And then those people are helping throughout the organization. So there's two questions here in my mind. So the
Mm.
first is, as you're starting to build out design, what are those key capabilities? So if you could just break it down again for us in terms of what do you see as those key capabilities that an organization needs? And then the second piece is how do you now move from a few people who have
Yeah.
that type of knowledge and experience to a larger organization that can do this work and make things happen?
First, you got to show evidence as a design leader or a design organization within a larger organization to show that. But a really skilled designer like the ones that we have in our team is able to have that level of conversation. Not a lot of designers out there know how to have that kind of conversation. So it is the design conversations that a skilled designer know how to have with the business, the product managers, the engineers, and possibly the customers or the clients to have that level of conversation. That's only the beginning. But now, once you know how to have that conversation, it is the designer's capability to be able to facilitate them, again, these cross-functional people with different um, priorities to converge into a solution. Those are the kind of capabilities I look for and I hire in my team. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So that alignment, in my experience, has been the complication, right? In terms of if you can't do that well, then
Mm.
you're not able to get traction. You're not able to get things made and built that shows the value that gets you to more money, more funding, right, to continue to do the work.
But again, a good designer can step back and say, maybe there is the real design is not designing something per se, but it's to solve the problem in another way, right? So we've always had, for example, the human-centered researchers that knows what's going on and qualitative side. we also have data folks who know how to do, work on the quantitative side, but we're missing something which is like deep process engineering and process steps, right? It sounds like it's the same with service designers doing, user journeys, but it's really not the same, right? Similar, but not the same. I've learned this in my time at IDEO. It's like they've always been not afraid to hire people that are not designers. They hire writers, they hire psychologists, they hire food scientists, they hire so many different types. So that's how you scale.
So that's something that I also saw myself when I was working, at my previous company, as well as currently in my role now, in terms of the more perspectives that you can bring in, the better it is in terms of thinking about those solutions. And
100%.
And Derek, the way that I've taken away some of what you captured or what you've said before is that really being solution oriented, right? Thinking through how these tools can help you towards the solution, but not being too locked in to like, this is the only tool set that can be used, right? Thinking through it and making sure that you're using the right tools, whether it's design thinking, whether it is, prototyping, whatever it is, just really being clear in terms of, can we use this to solve the solution? If we can, great, let's do it. If not, let's pick something else and move forward.
Yeah. The two things that I'm driving in my team is product over process. What is the product versus the process? So I would say leverage all the processes that you know, and that's why we hire you for that. But your language should be about the product, not the process. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the first thing. Next one, prioritize outcome over outputs. And first of all, how do you, as a designer, break it into parts to have those conversations with product managers, business, operations, engineers, to execute on each and every one of them and iterate along the way, right?
I'd like to talk a little bit more about a couple of things there. So one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit more about is outcome versus output.
Yep.
So these beautiful deliverables, right, which are outputs versus an outcome. And in my mind, when I think of outcome, I think of, well, we were able to develop something faster. So that's an outcome. That's a value for the business. That's an outcome. We were able to, grow into a new market because we had some new features, capabilities, and that's something that's an outcome.
I always talk about 4 types of key goals, which drives different outcomes, right? There's revenue, direct revenue. Potentially it helps a company drives new revenues, net new revenues. These are not just existing revenues. So an outcome could be, we have a new revenue stream we can create from there. That's a net new direct revenue. Second, it could be a revenue contribution, which means this design or experience helps drive an uplift in our current product and services. Third, cost savings. Does the design, because of that, reduces a lot of operational cost so that we can save on cost, basically, right? The last one is cost avoidance.
And when you start to think of those 4 things, are you running programs and measurement programs around those?
So this is the interesting part where my immediate answer was no, because I'm always a pro cross-functional team collaboration, where, again, re-emphasizing the design is more important than to be left to designers. So whenever my researchers go out to understand where the problem is, they first work with the colleagues in data, right? And you're in data, so you know that. It's like, what are the signals that we're seeing that really are pointing to a certain set of potential problems? Are the signals, as you know very well, are they just noise or are they true signals, right?
That's great. And that takes discipline from the organization in terms of being able to get that type of information right up front.
We can't do it alone by design. You need the data team, you need the product team to, we all have to work together to align on, if this is the case, here is the OKRs that we want to hypothesize against and measure against. And once we have that outcome or the product itself, let's measure again against it, right? To see did we, do we move the needle.
That's great. So those were the couple of things that I wanted to just explore a bit more from the topics on just
Yep.
design. So I don't know if there's anything else that you want to share around analytics and design, because that's something that we're very much interested in here at
Yep.
Impact Signal. So
Yep.
specifically, you talked about being able to really start up front and understanding what you want to move, right? How do
Yep.
you want to move the needle? Where do you want to move the needle? And then
Yep.
building towards that, which is great. Is there anything else that you think is really important as you start to think about how analytics and design can help to make sure that
Oh, yeah.
you are doing the right things, solving the right problems, delivering the value?
Yeah, there's so many different dimensions to that. Now, first of all, I want to caveat to say I am not an expert in data science or analytics or anything of that sort. I learned a lot from my good friend and colleague who's a VP of data. He and I jam a lot together, and we discuss a lot of things of where we can bring this, right? So I'm learning a lot from my data colleagues. But from the little that I understand, let's put it this way, I start to see that it has to be so much more embedded into everything that we do. I always say that data is the bloodstream of everything that we do in an organization, right? It goes through everything. The second thing is like there are so many different layers of data sets that needs to be driven, and analytics in that sense, driven across the organization. First is the consumable sets for the executives. Second is the data sets that we need to manage, meaning like all the how we're doing across the business that elevates back to all kind of like points back to what the executives need to see, and then the middle layer will then point back down to possibly a product layer, which is like within the product with analytics of a user experience and all these things. So you need tools in all this place, but you also need a system and programming behind it to say, how does all these things connect and ultimately lead to one key measure, right?
Mm-hmm. So Derek, at this point, I think the next thing I want to talk to you a bit about is just adaptation. So, the way that, when Josh and I were thinking about, connecting with you, one of the things that we talked about was just, the hospitality industry and how that has gone through a lot of change over the last year, 2 years, and just, spending some time with you to just talk about that in terms of being where you are,
Yep.
sitting in what I would say the middle of a storm.
Yep.
What are the things that have been some of the biggest changes to the way that you do design, that's come out of that?
Hospitality there's so many versions of hospitality. I think I mean just on a broad scale, like you saw the impact of the aviation industry, not good. Hotel industry also not good, right? They got to get really creative. On the area that I'm working in, we saw tremendous growth and also challenges as well. The interesting thing part about hospitality is that is quite a lot of it is very ground operations per se, right? So, but the demand that we've seen in a post-COVID world or during COVID world was an explosion in need for digital to play a bigger role. And that's why I mentioned we were so busy during COVID times, because the demand was just asking for us to accelerate our work and to create much more net new solutions that cater to the COVID world. Is about giving people a sense of safety, security, convenience, all these things. So suddenly the whole landscape changed, right? But I saw that as an opportunity for us to innovate in a lot of things that we've never thought before, right? Which is, how do you now rejig your ground operations so that the workflow is no longer a how it used to be, but a much more digital workflow. So then you lead with digital. And then when you lead with digital, you got to think about, okay, now what is the role of that person? That has a lot of operation implications that design again can play a role in looking into these steps and really understand what we need from a service design perspective to rethink the entire digital flow rather than digital to complement an existing analog flow. I hope that makes sense.
It does. And one of
Yeah.
the things that we've been talking about through these coffee chats is digital first, and how there has now been a push towards digital first. So, and what does that mean for the organization? So you start to talk a little bit about, what does that mean for the people? What does that mean for the operations? What does that mean for, so many different layers of the organizations when you're trying to go digital first? So it does make a lot of sense. It does resonate. And I would just ask a follow-up, what are some of the things that you learned, right, as you're going forward and tackling those challenges as a designer that was really important?
We got to think when we introduce a digital workflow, we think it's, we create a interaction on the screen, whether it's an iPad, TV, or computer. We just ship it to the operations, which are thousands of workers, right? That everything's hunky-dory. The opposite cannot be more true, right? So what happened is this: we actually innovated in a lot of digital workflow processes that we think is really smooth, and it is actually very smooth on paper, right? So if we do this, we click this, and then all is done. Then we went down recently, just a few weeks ago, we went to our what we call operations, which are the areas where we run our hospitality business. We had our product managers, designers, researchers work in the kitchens and leverage the tools they themselves designed. So they came back with like super enriched and elevated understanding of what it really means, not because they miss it, but because when they are in a situation where you have to multitask different things, just focusing on designing what's on your product needs to be thoughtfully thought about the product in relationship with everything else that goes around the product.
That's really interesting to me, because that's something that we've been talking a little bit more on some of our projects in terms of, we always do the user research. We always understand the needs, the motivation, and those pieces. But then the context, and really getting deeper on the context of the work. So, I'll give you an example, Derek. One of the things that we were working with was we were working with healthcare practitioners and, related to medical information. And just, so you can think about the information, how people learn, and all of these things that are really important as you design a solution. But then if you're not thinking about the context of when that learning is taking place, that leaves gaps in the solutioning. So that for us was like a really interesting learning that we took away from the project in terms of making sure that, there's that next layer that's really important, and really being cognizant around how do we capture that information? How do we test that information a bit more than what we initially had thought, right?
Can I chime in here? Because you mentioned healthcare. It's super interesting. How healthcare software is being implemented into an existing analog process, healthcare process. As a healthcare software provider, specifically for this use case, you got to think about voice, right? Or some kind of interaction that it could be gesture, it could be voice, it could be whatever, that doesn't promote cross-contamination of, from a lab, petri dish onto your keyboard or mouse. That's true design, right? You really think through all this kind of thing. And that's what I really like. I like to hire designers that think through this kind of things.
Yeah, because that's a great example of just context, right, Derek? In terms of, and that next layer of understanding that you get from situational information that isn't always considered.
Apparent. It's not always apparent.
Right. So I think those two things. So once it's not always apparent, and then from there, because it's not apparent, it's not being considered, right, as you think through the solution. And there are great opportunities around that now, going forward, for designers to start to think of, how do you solution? How do you take these new constraints, or maybe not new constraints, but these constraints now. That,
real constraints.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
real context, real world
yeah,
context. Yeah.
yeah. Derek, thank you. I think that that's a nice place for us to just close things off for today. Really appreciate you taking the time,
It's been wonderful.
sharing your thoughts, your insights. You know, again, your career has gone into many different places, many different areas. So it's really nice to just hear some of the things that you're thinking about and the things that you believe will be important for the future.
No, thank you. It's been wonderful. I'm learning, and for me, it's like everything that I observe turn into learning, and whatever I'm learning, I'm so happy to share it with on this platform with with you and your audience. So really happy about it.